The steel floor was cold enough to hurt. Elio Navarro pressed his spine against the concrete wall and tried to breathe without shaking. His hands cradled the swell of his belly. 7 months now, heavy and impossible to hide. The baby kicked once, hard, like it knew they were in danger. The conference room smelled like cigars and old leather. Men in tailored suits sat around a glass table that reflected the overhead lights in sharp, cruel lines. None of them looked at him. Not really. They glanced past him the way people glance past furniture. Except one. Rafe Calderón stood at the head of the table, arms crossed, jaw tight. His eyes were dark and unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and flat. "You're the translator?" Elio nodded. His throat was too dry to answer out loud. Rafe's gaze dropped to Elio's stomach, then back up. No expression, no warmth, just a flicker of something that might have been disgust or might have been nothing at all. "They said you speak 7 languages. Elio swallowed. "Yes." One of the other men laughed. Not loud, just enough to sting. "Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is." Rafe didn't laugh. He didn't move. He just stared at Elio like he was trying to decide whether to waste his time or not. "Pick one," Rafe said. "Stick to it. We don't need stories." The words hit like a slap. Elio's chest tightened. He'd heard this before. In shelters. In hospital waiting rooms. In offices where people smiled and lied and turned him away the second his pregnancy became visible. Nobody believed him. Nobody ever believed him. He wanted to argue. To prove it. To pull out the certifications he'd folded into his jacket pocket like some kind of armor. But arguing only made things worse. He'd learned that the hard way. So he nodded again. Understood. Rafe's jaw ticked. He turned away and gestured to the men at the table. "Let's get this over with." Elio stood in the corner, hands still on his belly, heart hammering so hard he thought it might crack a rib. The baby kicked again, softer this time, like it was trying to comfort him. The meeting started in Italian, then Russian, then something Elio recognized as Polish but twisted with a dialect he'd only heard once before, in a detention center 3 years ago, when he'd been trying to translate his way out of deportation. He translated everything, perfectly, word for word, tone for tone. Nobody thanked him. Nobody even looked at him, except Rafe. Rafe watched him the way a hunter watches movement in the trees. Not curious, just aware. And then one of the foreign delegates, a man with gray hair and a scar along his temple, muttered something under his breath. In Ukrainian, low enough that he probably thought no one would catch it. But Elio caught it. Every word. It wasn't business. It wasn't negotiation. It was cruel, personal. A slur about omegas, about pregnancy, about how easy it was to use someone and throw them away when they stopped being useful. Elio's hands went cold. He knew those words. He'd heard them before, in places where people didn't think he mattered, where they didn't think he understood. For a second, he couldn't breathe. And then he did something he'd never done before. He didn't translate. He responded. In Ukrainian. 3 words. Calm, clear, precise. Tai any pravi. You are wrong. The room went silent. The delegate's face drained of color. His mouth opened, closed. He glanced at Rafe, then back at Elio, and for the first time all night, someone looked at Elio like he was real. Rafe's head turned slowly. His eyes locked on Elio, not with anger, not with surprise, with something sharper. What did you just say? Elio's pulse roared in his ears. He kept his voice steady. I corrected him. The delegate stammered an apology. In English, in Russian, in anything that might make the moment go away. But Rafe didn't look away from Elio. And when the meeting finally ended, when the delegates filed out and the room emptied, Rafe didn't dismiss him. He stepped closer, close enough that Elio could smell the faint trace of smoke on his collar. Close enough that the air between them felt tight and dangerous. Rafe's voice dropped to a whisper. Prove it, or leave. What do you think Elio should do? Would you have stayed silent, or would you have spoken up? Elio's fingers trembled as he reached into his jacket pocket. Rafe stood 3 feet away, arms crossed, expression carved from stone. Waiting. The pocket was deep. The papers inside were worn soft from being folded and unfolded too many times. Elio pulled them out slowly, careful not to tear anything. His hands were shaking too hard to trust. He set the first document on the table. A UN linguistic certification, stamped, dated, signed by people whose names carried weight in places that mattered. Rafe glanced at it, didn't touch it. Elio set down the second. Immigration transcripts. Pages and pages of interviews conducted in 6 different languages. His answers, his voice, archived. Still, Rafe didn't move. The third document was different, heavier. It was a set of intercepted communications, coded messages Elio had been hired to translate 2 years ago, back when he still had a work visa and a place to sleep that didn't smell like mold. Rafe finally picked that one up. His eyes scanned the text. Once, twice. Then he looked at Elio. "Where did you learn this?" Elio's throat was tight. Survival. It wasn't the answer Rafe wanted. Elio could see that, but it was the only one he had. He didn't learn languages in classrooms. He learned them in refugee camps, in border holding cells, in shelters where the person next to you might speak Russian or Farsi or Mandarin, and if you wanted to know where the food line was or which guards to avoid, you learned fast. Rafe set the paper down. His jaw worked like he was chewing on something bitter. "You embarrassed a man who's killed for less." Elio's stomach dropped. The baby kicked once, sharp and insistent, like it was telling him to run. But there was nowhere to run. "I corrected him," Elio said again, quieter this time. Rafe's eyes narrowed. "You think that makes you safe?" "No." The word came out before Elio could stop it. "Honest, bro." He didn't feel safe. He never felt safe. Rafe stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned and walked to the window. The city lights stretched out below them, cold and endless. "You stay," Rafe said without looking back. "But one mistake, and you're gone." Elio's knees almost buckled with relief. He pressed a hand to the table to steady himself. "Thank you." Rafe's shoulders tensed. "Don't thank me. Just do your job." Elio nodded even though Rafe wasn't looking. He gathered his papers with shaking hands and folded them back into his pocket. As he turned to leave, Rafe spoke again. "Stay after the next meeting." Elio froze. "Why?" Rafe finally looked at him. His expression was unreadable, controlled, dangerous. "Because I said so." Do you think Rafe is testing Elio? Or is there something else going on? Drop your thoughts below. The next meeting came faster than Elio expected. 2 days later, he was back in the same conference room, standing in the same corner, heart pounding in the same frantic rhythm. This time, the delegates were different. Eastern European. Older. Meaner. One of them kept staring at Elio's belly with a look that made his skin crawl, like he was deciding how much Elio was worth, or how little. Rafe sat at the head of the table, still and silent, watching everything. The meeting started in Russian, then switched to Polish. Then something that sounded like Czech but wasn't quite right. Elio translated without hesitation. His voice stayed calm even though his pulse was screaming. And then one of the men said something in German. Fast. Clipped. Test. Elio responded in the same language. Fluent. Flawless. The man's eyebrows lifted. He switched to French. Elio switched with him. Then Italian. Then Mandarin. By the time the man ran out of languages, the room had gone quiet. Rafe's eyes were locked on Elio. Not with doubt anymore, with something else. When the meeting ended, the delegates filed out without a word. The door clicked shut. Rafe stood. Slowly. He walked around the table, footsteps measured and deliberate, until he was standing directly in front of Elio. Too close. Close enough that Elio had to tilt his head back to meet his eyes. Rafe reached out. His hand landed on Elio's shoulder. Firm. Heavy. Not violent, but not gentle either. Straighten your back, Rafe said quietly. You're not a victim here. Elio's breath caught. The weight of Rafe's hand pressed down, and for a second, He didn't know if he was being corrected or controlled. He straightened anyway. Rafe's hand stayed there a moment longer. Then he let go. "You rehearsed that," Rafe said. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Elio shook his head. "No." "Then how?" "I told you. Survival." Rafe's jaw tightened. He stepped back, but his eyes didn't leave Elio's face. "One mistake," he repeated. "And you're done." Elio nodded. His shoulder still felt warm where Rafe's hand had been. As he turned to leave, Rafe's voice stopped him. "Don't go." Elio turned back, confused. "What?" Rafe crossed his arms. His expression was hard, unreadable. "You're staying after this meeting. We need to talk." Elio's chest tightened. "About what?" Rafe didn't answer. He just stared. And Elio realized, with a cold, sinking certainty, that he wasn't free to leave anymore. What would you do if you were in Elio's position? Let us know in the comments. Rafe's office was smaller than Elio expected. No windows, no glass table, just a desk, 2 chairs, and a single lamp that cast long shadows across the walls. Rafe closed the door behind them. The sound echoed. Elio stood in the center of the room, hands folded over his belly, trying to keep his breathing steady. Rafe moved to the desk but didn't sit. He leaned against it instead, arms crossed, eyes sharp. "You lied." Elio's heart stopped. "I didn't." 7 languages, Rafe said. His voice was flat, cold. "That's what you told me." "Yes. And you expect me to believe that?" Elio's hands tightened. "I already proved it. You proved you can memorize phrases. That's not the same thing." The accusation hit harder than it should have. Elio had spent years fighting this exact fight. People who thought intelligence was performance. People who thought survival was luck. He pulled the papers from his pocket again. Slower this time, more careful. He set them on the desk one by one. UN certifications, immigration transcripts, coded documents annotated in 7 different languages. Proof. Hard proof. Rafe picked up the top sheet. His eyes scanned the text. Once, twice. Then he set it down and looked at Elio. "Where did you really learn this?" Elio's throat was tight. "I already told you. Tell me again." Elio took a breath. His voice came out quieter than he wanted. "I learned Russian in a detention center, Polish in a refugee camp, Mandarin from a woman who shared her food with me when I had nothing, French from a lawyer who tried to help me get asylum, Italian because the shelter I stayed in was run by nuns who only spoke it, German because I had to." He paused. His hands shook. "I didn't learn them for status. I learned them because if I didn't, I'd be erased." The room was silent. Rafe stared at him. Not with pity, not with sympathy, with something Elio couldn't name. Finally, Rafe straightened. He moved around the desk, slow and deliberate, until he was standing directly in front of Elio. The space between them was too small, the air too tight. Rafe's voice dropped, low, almost a whisper. "You're not leaving." Elio's pulse roared. "What?" "You're staying here, under my protection." "I didn't ask for protection." "You don't get a choice." Elio's chest tightened. Fear and something else tangled together in his stomach. "Why?" Rafe's eyes didn't leave his. "Because you're valuable. And valuable things don't survive on their own." What do you think Rafe's real motive is? Comment below. Elio didn't return to the conference room for 3 days. Not because he was afraid. Fear had long since calcified into something harder, more useful caution. The kind that kept refugees alive when borders closed and languages became the only passport that mattered. The kind that taught you to measure every word, every gesture, every moment of visibility against the potential cost. But Rafe had summoned him anyway. The message came through Victor, Rafe's second-in-command, a scarred beta who spoke only in complete sentences, as if words were rationed like ammunition. "Boss wants you. 4th floor. Noon. Don't be late." Elio arrived at 11:47. Early was safe. Early meant control. Early meant you dictated the terms of your own arrival, claimed space before it could be denied to you. He'd learned that in processing centers where lateness meant missing meals, missing interviews, missing the narrow window between deportation and salvation. The conference room was empty except for Rafe, who stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Chicago's skyline. The city sprawled beneath them like a chessboard, territories carved and claimed, boundaries invisible but absolute. From this height, the violence that ran through those streets like arterial blood was invisible. Beautiful, almost. Rafe didn't turn when Elio entered. Didn't acknowledge the soft click of the door, the careful placement of Elio's worn leather satchel on the chair, the way Elio's hand automatically went to his belly, 6 months now, the weight becoming undeniable. "The Russian," Rafe said finally, still facing the window. His reflection was sharp in the glass, all angles and controlled violence. "What did you say to him?" Elio had expected this question. He'd been expecting it since the moment the distributor's face had drained of color, since the apology had tumbled out in fractured syllables like broken glass. He'd rehearsed his answer in 3 languages, tested the weight of different phrasings, calculated the safest route through this conversation. "I told him his mother would be ashamed," Elio said quietly, his accent careful, neutral, the voice of someone trained to offend no one. Rafe turned then. His expression was unreadable, the same mask he wore during executions, negotiations, betrayals, the mask that had made him one of the most feared men in Chicago before his 30th birthday. "That's not 3 words. It is in Russian." Elio's hand drifted to his belly again, an unconscious gesture of protection that he developed somewhere between the 3rd and 4th month. The baby kicked sometimes when voices were raised, as if already learning to flinch from conflict. "Tvoya mat poser." The silence stretched between them like a tightrope, thin, dangerous, requiring perfect balance. Rafe crossed the room with deliberate slowness, each step measured. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough to intimidate, far enough to maintain the illusion of professional distance. "You embarrassed a man who's killed for insults half that severe," Rafe said. "Not a threat, an observation, a lesson in consequences." "I corrected him," Elio replied, using the same words from before, because they were true then, and they were true now, and truth didn't change based on audience. Rafe studied him with the intensity of a predator assessing prey, except Elio had learned long ago that staying still was sometimes the deadliest response. Prey ran. Survivors calculated. Survivors knew when movement meant safety and when it meant exposure. "You're not afraid of me," Rafe said. "I'm terrified of you," Elio corrected, meeting his gaze directly for the first time. "But fear doesn't change facts. And the fact is, I speak 7 languages because I had to learn 7 different ways to say, 'Please don't send me back.' 7 different ways to prove I was worth keeping alive. 7 different versions of begging dressed up as competence." Something shifted in Rafe's expression. Not sympathy. Rafe didn't traffic in sympathy. It was a luxury he'd abandoned somewhere in his own brutal apprenticeship. But recognition, perhaps, the acknowledgement that survival took many forms, and not all of them involved violence. Some involved making yourself so useful that killing you became inconvenient. "Show me," Rafe said. Elio blinked. "Show you what?" "The languages. The proof. Show me I was wrong." It wasn't a request. The command was buried in the phrasing, gentle as a knife wrapped in silk. Elio had carried his documentation for exactly this reason, the certifications from the UN, the transcripts from asylum interviews conducted in 5 countries, the intercepted communications he translated for immigration attorneys who tried to help him navigate systems designed to reject. Each document represented a different kind of survival, a different test passed. He spread them across the conference table like cards in a hand he'd been forced to play too many times. Documents in Italian, French, Russian, Arabic, Spanish, Portuguese, English. Some bore official seals. Others showed signs of having been handled by too many bureaucratic hands. Creased, stained, stamped with the machinery of displacement. Rafe read in silence. His finger traced lines of text, paused on certifications, lingered on a particular asylum transcript that detailed Elio's translation work in a detention facility outside Marseille. 300 interviews. 42 languages between them. Elio had served as the bridge between desperate people and indifferent systems. When Rafe finally looked up, his expression hadn't softened. But something had shifted, an imperceptible recalibration, the way a weapon is re-aimed when the target moves. "Why didn't you defend yourself when I called you a liar?" Rafe asked. The question was quieter than expected, almost curious. Elio chose his words carefully. "Because in my experience, men who need to prove their power by dismissing others rarely change their minds when challenged. They just get louder. They escalate. And escalation." He touched his belly. "Escalation is dangerous when you're carrying someone else's future." The corner of Rafe's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. The ghost of something human beneath the armor. "You're right," Rafe said. Then, after a pause that felt weighted with calculation, "I need you for another job." Elio's stomach tightened. Not the baby, but the old instinct. The one that screamed danger whenever opportunity dressed itself in professional language. In the underworld, another job was often code for something that required plausible deniability. Something that left bodies or legal consequences in its wake. But Rafe surprised him. "There's a shipment coming in from Marseille. French Algerians. They don't trust Italian speakers, and they sure as hell don't trust Russians after what happened in Moscow last year. I need someone who can translate not just words, but intent, subtext. The things people say when they think no one's listening carefully enough to catch them." Elio hesitated. The baby kicked. A small flutter of protest or agreement, he couldn't tell. At 6 months, every movement felt like a communication he was still learning to interpret. "I'm 6 months pregnant," Elio said carefully, stating the obvious. "I'm not exactly built for dockside intimidation." "Good," Rafe said, and this time the almost smile reached his eyes. "Because I don't need intimidation. I need precision. I need someone who understands that the most dangerous lies are the ones wrapped in perfect grammar." And for the first time since entering Rafe's world, Elio understood something crucial. This wasn't about trust. It was about utility. Rafe didn't care about Elio's past, his trauma, his survival story. He cared that Elio was useful, that his skills filled a gap that violence couldn't. And in the calculus of the underworld, useful was the closest thing to safe. "When?" Elio asked. "Friday, dawn. The docs don't wait for convenient schedules." Elio nodded slowly, already mentally preparing, reviewing his Algerian Arabic, refreshing the formal registers of French he'd need for negotiation. "I'll be there," he said. Rafe collected the documents, handled them with unexpected care, and passed them back. "You've survived things I can't imagine," he said quietly. "This should be easy by comparison." Elio took the documents, held them against his chest like armor. "Nothing is easy," he said. "Some things are just survivable." The docs smelled like salt, rust, and diesel. A combination that triggered memories Elio had spent years trying to bury in the shallow graves of necessary forgetting. Different coast, different cargo, different country, same desperation. He stood beside Rafe's armored vehicle at 5:47 a.m., watching the fog roll across Lake Michigan like a living thing, swallowing the horizon. The cold bit through his jacket. Not quite winter yet, but Chicago didn't believe in gentle transitions. The city moved from autumn to ice with the speed of a blade. The baby was active this morning, movements sharp and insistent. Elio pressed his hand to his belly, a silent communication. I know this is dangerous, but we're survivors. This is what we do." The Marseille crew arrived exactly on time, which in criminal logistics meant they were either extremely professional or extremely dangerous. Elio suspected both. 3 vehicles, Mercedes, black, with the kind of window tinting that didn't just suggest privacy but demanded it. Rafe had brought minimal security, just Victor and 2 enforcers who looked like they'd been carved from the same granite as the Chicago skyline. A show of confidence, not force. In the mathematics of criminal negotiation, Sometimes what you didn't bring spoke louder than what you did. The French Algerians matched them. 3 men emerged from the center vehicle, mid-30s, dressed in expensive casual where that screamed, "We don't need to prove anything." Designer leather jackets, watches that cost more than Elio's entire year of survival. The casual wealth of people who'd transcended the need for ostentation. Their leader, a man Elio recognized from the briefing files as Karim Ben Ali, shook Rafe's hand with the kind of grip that tested boundaries without crossing them. Then his eyes landed on Elio, the pregnant Omega standing slightly behind Rafe, notepad in hand, posture careful, visible but not prominent, present but not presumptuous. Karim's expression flickered, surprise, confusion, then something harder to name, calculation, perhaps. He said something in rapid French to his companions, the words tumbling out too fast for courtesy, too casual for negotiation. They laughed. The sound carried across the dock, sharp as breaking glass. Elio didn't translate. Not yet. Rafe glanced at him, one eyebrow raised. "Well, he said you brought a secretary to a business meeting." Elio replied in English, his voice neutral, professional. "I'm paraphrasing for politeness." What did he actually say? Rafe pressed, and there was something almost dangerous in his tone. A warning to Karim that Elio couldn't quite translate yet. Elio hesitated. The baby kicked again, harder this time. Then, "He said you brought a pregnant whore to negotiate like a man with no spine." He questioned whether Americans understood business or just theater. The air changed. Molecules rearranged themselves around violence. Victor's hand moved toward his weapon, not drawing, just establishing proximity. The enforcers tensed, shoulders squaring, weight shifting forward. Even the fog seemed to pause, waiting. But Rafe held up a hand. A single gesture that froze everyone in place like a photograph. Then he smiled. Not the warm kind, the kind that preceded calculated violence. The kind that had built his reputation across 3 states and 2 international borders. "Tell him," Rafe said slowly, each word deliberate as a chess move, "that I brought the only person in this city fluent enough in Algerian Arabic, specifically the Oran dialect, to know he just misquoted a price by 30% in his conversation with his associate. And if he wants to continue this conversation, he'll address my translator with respect. Or he can explain to his bosses in Marseille why the Chicago route just closed permanently." Elio translated, word for word, tone for tone. But he did something more. He switched from French to Algerian Arabic mid-sentence, using a specific dialect that indicated he knew exactly where Karim's family originated from. Not just the country, not just the region, the city, possibly the neighborhood. The kind of knowledge that couldn't be faked, couldn't be researched quickly enough to bluff. It was a power move wrapped in grammar, a threat disguised as linguistic precision. Karim's face went rigid. The casual arrogance evaporated, replaced by something closer to shock. He stared at Elio, really looked at him this time, seeing past the pregnancy, past the Omega status, past the assumptions. "You speak Derja?" Karim asked in Arabic, using the colloquial term for the dialect. His voice had changed, less performative, more genuine. "I survived a detention center outside Oran for 8 months," Elio replied in the same dialect, matching his register, his rhythm. "I learned quickly." You learn fast when the alternative is deportation to a country that doesn't want you back. The tension didn't disappear, but it shifted, recalibrated. Karim nodded slowly, a gesture that carried weight. Then, in careful English that acknowledged the multilingual audience, "My apologies. I mistook competence for decoration. A mistake I won't repeat." Elio didn't acknowledge the apology, didn't smile, didn't offer reassurance. He simply opened his notepad, pen poised. "Shall we begin?" he asked. The negotiation lasted 2 hours and 17 minutes. Prices, routes, timelines, contingencies, percentage splits, insurance against interdiction, backup plans for the backup plans. The criminal logistics of moving goods across borders that existed on paper but dissolved in practice for those with enough money and violence to erase them. Elio translated everything. Not just words, but the spaces between them. When Kareem implied a threat, Elio made it explicit. When Rafe offered a concession, Elio framed it as strategy, not weakness. He navigated the subtext like a cartographer mapping dangerous territory, marking the places where language could collapse into violence if handled carelessly. He caught a deliberate mistranslation attempt from one of Kareem's associates, a subtle shift in percentage that would have cost Rafe's organization $200,000 over the course of a year. Elio corrected it smoothly in Arabic, making it seem like a simple clarification rather than calling out the deception directly. Saving face while protecting interests, Kareem noticed. His eyes flicked to Elio with something like respect. By the end, both sides had what they needed. The contracts, such as they were in a world where signatures meant less than witnessed handshakes, were established. As they prepared to leave, Kareem approached Elio directly, ignoring protocol, ignoring the subtle threat of Victor's proximity. "The center outside Oren," he said quietly in Arabic, his voice stripped of performance. "The one near the port, with the blue walls and the holding cells that flooded every spring." Elio's breath caught. "You know it. I know people who were there. Family, friends, people who didn't make it out." Kareem's expression softened. Just slightly, just enough to be human. "I'm sorry you had to see that place." Elio looked at him, really looked, and saw the same thing he saw in every survivor. The weight of what couldn't be forgotten. "I didn't just see it," Elio said. "I translated for it. Asylum interviews, deportation hearings, medical emergencies where the doctors didn't speak the same language as the patients. I learned 7 languages because every border required a different way to beg. Every system had its own vocabulary for rejection." Kareem's jaw tightened. "And now you work for him?" He tilted his head toward Rafe, who was conferring with Victor 30 feet away. "Now I survive," Elio corrected. "The method changes. The goal doesn't." Kareem nodded, understanding in a way that only other survivors could. Then, in English loud enough for Rafe to hear, "Your translator is worth more than this entire shipment. Whatever you're paying him, double it. And protect him. People like him don't come around often." Rafe didn't respond verbally, but his expression acknowledged the comment. Later, in the car ride back to the city, Rafe said something Elio hadn't expected. "You didn't have to tell him about Oren." Elio watched the city wake up through the tinted windows. People starting their days, ordinary lives built on foundations they never questioned. "He needed to know I wasn't just translating," Elio said. "I was remembering." Rafe was silent for a long moment, navigating traffic with the same precision he applied to negotiations. Then, "Memory is a weapon too." Elio touched his belly, feeling the baby shift and settle. "No," he said quietly. "Memory is a scar. What you do with it determines whether it's a weapon or a witness." Rafe didn't argue. The silence that followed felt different. Less empty, more like understanding. The attack came in the form of flowers. A bouquet delivered to Elio's apartment on a Tuesday afternoon. Modest arrangement, professional presentation, delivered to a neighborhood where anonymity was currency and curiosity could get you killed. White lilies and red roses, arranged with the kind of precision that suggested expense and expertise. No card, no sender information, just flowers. Elio stared at them for 3 full minutes before his survival instincts, the ones honed in detention centers and border checkpoints, started screaming. White lilies. In Greek, Italian, and several Asian cultures, they were funeral flowers. Sympathy arrangements, the kind you sent when someone died. Red roses with thorns still attached. Not romantic. A threat wrapped in false courtesy. The thorns were the message, beauty that could wound. Together, they formed a sentence in the language of criminal intimidation. "We know where you live. We could end you, but we're being polite about it. For now." Elio's hand went to his belly. 7 months now. The baby's movements constant and insistent. Then to his phone. Rafe answered on the second ring. "This better be important." "Someone sent me flowers," Elio said, his voice carefully controlled. "Congratulations." Rafe replied dryly. Is this a social call or— White lilies, Elio interrupted. Funeral flowers in multiple cultures, and red roses with thorns still attached, which in the language of organized crime means a threat wrapped in false courtesy. They were delivered to my apartment. My address, the place I've been careful never to connect to your organization officially. The silence on the other end was absolute. Then, don't touch them. Don't touch anything. I'm sending Victor. Lock your door. Don't open it for anyone except him. I'll call you back in 3 minutes. The line went dead. Elio locked the door, drew the curtains, sat on his worn couch with his phone in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other. Not because he thought he could fight off professional killers, but because having a weapon made the waiting slightly more bearable. The baby kicked. Elio placed his free hand on his belly. I know, he whispered. I know you didn't sign up for this. Neither did I, but we're survivors. We'll figure it out. Victor arrived within 20 minutes, record time for Chicago traffic. He brought 2 specialists. One who examined the bouquet for toxins, biological agents, listening devices, anything that could harm beyond the psychological message. The other traced the delivery route using methods Elio decided not to ask about. The flowers were clean, no poison, no devices, just flowers. But the delivery, untraceable, paid in cash at a courier service that specialized in plausible deniability. The kind of place that catered to people who needed things delivered without creating paper trails. The courier who'd actually brought them to Elio's door had been hired through 3 layers of intermediaries. Dead ends wrapped in dead ends. But the message was crystal clear. Someone knew where Elio lived. Someone wanted him to know they knew. Someone was testing boundaries, measuring responses, calculating whether Rafe cared enough about his translator to respond to threats. Rafe showed up an hour later, which was unusual. Rafe didn't make house calls. He summoned people to his territory, maintained the psychological advantage of home ground. His presence in Elio's modest apartment was a statement in itself. He stood in the small kitchen, looking severely out of place among the second-hand furniture, peeling paint, and the carefully maintained cleanliness of someone who'd learned early that dignity was sometimes the only thing you could control. Pack a bag, Rafe said without preamble. Elio didn't move. I'm not leaving my home because of flowers. This isn't about flowers, Rafe snapped, and there was something almost frantic beneath the command. Unusual for a man who'd built his reputation on cold calculation. This is about the Dmitrov syndicate making a territorial play. They're testing boundaries, seeing if they can pressure me through my assets. And you, pregnant, visible, associated with me, you're an asset they think they can leverage. So I'm leverage, Elio said flatly, the word tasting bitter. You're a target, Rafe corrected, stepping closer. There's a difference. Leverage implies negotiation, back and forth, eventual resolution. Targets just disappear. They get used as examples, as warnings, as messages written in blood to prove points about power. The words hung heavy in the small kitchen, occupying space like additional people. Elio's hand went to his belly again. 7 months. The baby was real now, undeniable, a future that existed outside of Elio's own survival calculations. For years, he'd only had to keep himself alive. Now there was someone else, someone who hadn't chosen this world, this danger, this constant calculation of threat levels. If I run, Elio said slowly, I prove that I'm worth threatening, that scaring me produces results. And then every faction that wants to pressure you will know exactly how to do it. If you stay, Rafe countered, you prove that you're accessible, that my protection has limits, that there are gaps in my security that can be exploited. So I'm damned either way. Welcome to my world. Elio looked around his apartment. It wasn't much. Bare walls, second-hand furniture, a kitchen table that wobbled unless you knew to put folded paper under the right leg. But it was his. The first place he'd ever lived where the locks were his to control, where the walls didn't echo with the sounds of others suffering, where he could close the door and pretend, for brief moments, that he was safe. How long? Elio asked. resignation settling into his bones like winter cold. Until I neutralized the threat. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have, Rafe said. Then softer, in a tone Elio had never heard from him. I don't ask people to trust me. I know what I am, what I've built. But I'm asking you to trust that I don't leave debts unpaid. You've been useful to me, more than useful. You've made me money, prevented conflicts, built bridges I couldn't build with violence. That means something in my world. That means you're worth protecting. Elio wanted to laugh at the absurdity. Useful. As if that was the metric for human worth. As if survival could be calculated in profit margins and prevented conflicts. But in Rafe's world, maybe it was. Maybe usefulness was the only currency that bought protection. Maybe being valuable was the closest thing to being safe. One bag, Elio said finally. And I need books. Real ones, not digital. If I'm going into hiding, I'm not doing it without something to keep my mind occupied. Rafe's expression flickered, surprise, maybe. Books? I'm pregnant and going into hiding, Elio said, moving toward his bedroom to pack. I'm not doing it without Tolstoy, or Dostoevsky, or anything that reminds me that people have survived worse things than Chicago's criminal underworld. For the first time since they'd met, Rafe actually smiled. Not the dangerous kind he used in negotiations. Not the cold kind that preceded violence. A real smile, brief as lightning but unmistakable. One bag, he agreed, and all the Russian literature you can carry. Elio packed quickly, efficiently. Another skill learned in detention centers where you never knew when you'd be moved, transferred, deported. Essentials only. Clothes for various stages of pregnancy. Documentation he could never afford to lose. The books that had kept him human through inhuman experiences. And a small wooden box containing the only photograph he had from before. A family he couldn't return to, in a country that had collapsed into the kind of violence that created refugees. Victor drove them to the safe house. Rafe followed in a separate vehicle, security protocol, maintaining deniability, ensuring that if one vehicle was compromised, the other could respond. The safe house was on the north side, tucked into a neighborhood wealthy enough to have private security, but not so wealthy that new faces would be immediately noticed. A 3-bedroom house with reinforced windows, a panic room disguised as a linen closet, and the kind of sophisticated security system that cost more than Elio had earned in the past 5 years combined. Kitchen stocked, Victor said, doing a quick sweep of the rooms. Security codes are here. You see anything unusual, anything at all, you call this number immediately. Not Rafe. This number. Direct line to rapid response. Elio took the card. Memorized the number out of habit. How long has this place been active? 3 years, Victor said. You're the 7th person to use it. All of them survived whatever they were hiding from. That's a good track record. After Victor left, Elio stood in the living room of his temporary prison and felt the weight of displacement settle over him like a familiar coat. Different country, different threat, same feeling of being moved against his will for his own protection. The baby kicked, strong and insistent. I know, Elio whispered, hand on his belly. I know this isn't fair, but fair stopped mattering a long time ago. Now we just survive. He unpacked his books, arranged them on the empty shelf. A small claim of territory, a reminder that even in hiding, he could create something resembling home. And he waited. The safe house was exactly as advertised. Secure, isolated, and profoundly boring. 3 bedrooms decorated in aggressive neutrality. Beige walls, beige furniture, the kind of studied blandness that allowed occupants to project their own meaning onto empty space. Reinforced windows that looked normal but could withstand small arms fire. A panic room disguised as a linen closet, complete with satellite phone and 72 hours of emergency supplies. The kind of place where people waited for storms to pass, or for enemies to make fatal mistakes. Elio spent the first week reading Dostoevsky and trying not to think about the fact that his entire life fit into one duffel bag. Again, still, always, he'd furnished a corner of the living room with his books, creating a small library that felt like territory. Crime and Punishment, The Brothers Karamazov, Notes from Underground, stories about guilt, redemption, suffering, and the peculiar Russian conviction that meaning could be excavated from misery. Victor checked in daily, never stayed long, just confirmed Elio was alive, accounted for, and hadn't tried to leave. Each visit followed the same pattern. Security sweep, perimeter check, brief conversation that never quite crossed into personal territory, then departure. Professional, efficient, emotionally sterile. On day 8, Rafe visited. He arrived without warning, a test Elio realized to see if the security protocols held. To verify that unexpected arrivals would trigger appropriate responses, that the systems designed to protect would actually function under pressure. They did. Elio's phone buzzed with an alert 30 seconds before Rafe's car pulled into the driveway. Time enough to prepare, to arm himself if necessary, to retreat to the panic room if the alert had been a threat instead of an authorized visitor. Rafe found Elio in the living room, surrounded by books, one hand on his belly as the baby kicked with increasing frequency. 7.5 months now. The pregnancy had reached the stage where every movement was visible, where the abstract concept of future had become concrete, undeniable. "You look domestic," Rafe observed, standing in the doorway like he wasn't quite sure whether entering constituted invasion. "You look tired," Elio countered, and he did. Whatever war Rafe was waging against the Dmitrov syndicate, it was taking a toll visible even through his careful armor. Shadows under his eyes deep enough to have geography. Tension in his jaw that suggested teeth grinding through sleep, if he was sleeping at all. The kind of exhaustion that came from fighting battles on multiple fronts simultaneously, from making decisions where every option led to violence, just different flavors of it. "It's handled," Rafe said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "What's handled? The Dmitrovs. They made their play. I made mine. The threats neutralized." Elio set down his book, Crime and Punishment, fittingly. "If it's handled, why do you look like it's just beginning?" Rafe moved into the room properly, claimed one of the beige armchairs with the same territorial confidence he brought to everything. "Because they didn't just target you to get to me, they targeted you to make a point. That Omegas in my organization, anyone perceived as weak, as leverage, as acceptable collateral damage, are fair game. That there are categories of people I won't protect as fiercely as others. And," Elio pressed, "and I can't let that stand," Rafe said, and there was something almost cold in his voice. Not angry, colder than anger, calculated. "Not because of you specifically, because of precedent. If they think they can intimidate through you, they'll try it again. Different target, same strategy. They'll start systematically pressuring everyone in my organization they perceive as vulnerable until the organization itself becomes vulnerable." Elio absorbed this, feeling the baby shift inside him, a reminder of exactly how vulnerable he was. "So what did you do?" Rafe was silent for a long moment, and in that silence, Elio could hear all the things that wouldn't be said. The violence, the bodies, the systematic dismantling of human beings reduced to obstacles. "I removed their ability to make that mistake again," Rafe said finally. The clinical phrasing didn't disguise the violence. Elio had been around enough criminal infrastructure to know what removed their ability meant. It meant people were dead. It meant families were grieving. It meant violence had cascaded through networks of association until someone decided the cost was too high. People were dead. Because of him. Not directly, not by his hand, but the chain of causation was undeniable. "I didn't ask you to kill for me," Elio said quietly. "You didn't have to," Rafe replied, meeting his gaze directly. "The moment you stepped into my world, you became part of a system. And in that system, threats are neutralized. Not negotiated with, not reasoned with, eliminated. It's the only language that produces lasting results in this world." Elio felt the baby kick. Harder this time, as if protesting the conversation, the casual discussion of violence, the acceptance of death as administrative necessity. "I've spent my entire life trying to escape systems," Elio said, and he could hear the exhaustion in his own voice. refugee systems, immigration systems, detention systems, systems that decided my worth based on paperwork and policy and arbitrary enforcement, systems that treated human beings as problems to be processed or eliminated. And now I'm part of another one, your system, trading one form of dehumanization for another. Yes, Rafe said simply. No apology, no justification, just acknowledgement. Does it ever bother you? Elio asked. The violence, the control, the fact that you solve problems by erasing people from existence. Rafe considered the question with surprising seriousness, his expression shifting from defensive to something almost vulnerable. He stood, moved to the window, looked out at the quiet suburban street where nothing extraordinary ever seemed to happen. Every day, he said finally, so quietly Elio almost didn't hear. But regret doesn't change outcomes. It just makes you hesitate. And in this world, hesitation is fatal. You hesitate, you second-guess, you pause to consider the moral weight of a decision, and someone uses that pause to kill you, or kill the people depending on you. So you learn to act, to decide, to carry the weight afterward, but never let it slow you down in the moment. Elio looked at him, really looked. Beneath the authority, the violence, the carefully constructed dominance, there was something almost tragic. A man who'd built an empire on certainty but lived with the weight of every decision, who'd traded the luxury of doubt for the burden of consequence. You're not what I expected, Elio admitted. What did you expect? A monster, Elio said honestly. Someone who didn't think, didn't question, just acted. Someone who'd transcended guilt, who'd found a way to commit violence without carrying it. Monsters are easier, Rafe said, and there was something almost wistful in his voice. They don't lose sleep. They don't see the faces afterward. They don't count the cost in human terms. I envy them sometimes. The vulnerability was brief, fleeting, but real. A crack in the armor that closed almost as quickly as it appeared. Elio made a decision then, not based on trust, but on recognition. They were both survivors, just with different methods, different territories, different languages for navigating systems designed to destroy them. When can I go home? Elio asked. Soon, Rafe said, turning from the window. But not yet. I need to make sure the message is clear. That targeting you, targeting anyone under my protection, has consequences so severe that no one will try it again. Not now. Not ever. And how do you make that message clear? Rafe's smile was cold, sharp as a knife. I already have. The baby kicked again, and Elio wondered what kind of world he was bringing a child into. What kind of future existed in the spaces between violence and survival. Whether there was room for something gentler, something that didn't require constant calculation of threat levels. But he didn't ask, because he already knew the answer. You survived first. You built something better second. If you lived long enough. 3 weeks later, Elio returned to his apartment. It had been cleaned, professionally, the kind of deep cleaning that erased evidence, removed history, sanitized trauma. Everything was exactly where he'd left it, but somehow different, as if the space had been frozen in time, preserved like a museum exhibit of his previous life. The locks had been changed, upgraded to something that probably cost more than his entire year's rent. Biometric scanner, reinforced steel core. The kind of security that screamed, someone important lives here, to anyone paying attention. There were no flowers waiting, but there was a letter, hand-delivered, sealed with wax that bore the Calderón family crest. A pretentious touch that somehow fit perfectly with Rafe's particular brand of old-world criminality wrapped in modern violence. Elio opened it carefully, half expecting a threat, a summons, a final accounting of debts owed. Instead, he found 3 lines in Rafe's precise handwriting. You were right. Words are weapons. I'm building you an armory. Report to the office Monday. We have work to discuss. RC. Elio read it 3 times, translating the subtext the way he'd learned to translate everything in this world. Reading between the lines for the actual message beneath the surface meaning. I'm giving you power. Real power. The kind that doesn't come from violence but from something more valuable. He didn't understand. Not fully. Not until Monday, when he arrived at the Calderón building and was escorted not to the familiar fourth-floor conference room, but to an entire floor he'd never seen before. The sixth floor, previously used for storage, according to Victor's brief explanation during the elevator ride. Now something else entirely. The doors opened to reveal a space transformed, renovated, furnished, equipped with translation software he recognized from UN facilities. Professional grade, the kind that cost 6 figures. Soundproof booths for sensitive conversations. Individual workstations with dual monitors. A small library of reference materials in a dozen languages. Conference rooms with video equipment for remote interpretation. And staff, for Omegas, all multilingual, according to the nameplate on each desk. All watching him with expressions caught between hope and suspicion, the particular wariness of people who'd been promised things before and learned that promises in this world often came with invisible costs. Rafe stood in the center of it all, arms crossed, looking almost uncomfortable, as if he built something he wasn't quite sure how to explain. "Welcome to the Translation and Mediation Division," he said without preamble. "You're running it." Elio stared. The baby kicked. Hard, insistent, as if sharing his shock. "I'm what? You said systems decide worth based on paperwork and policy," Rafe said, moving through the space like he was giving a tour of territory he'd just conquered. "So I'm changing the paperwork. Rewriting the policy. This division handles all linguistic needs for the syndicate. Negotiations, contracts, intelligence gathering, dispute mediation, document analysis, and it's run by Omegas. Because apparently, you're the only ones who actually listen to what people mean instead of just what they say." Elio's mind raced, trying to process the implications. An entire division, real infrastructure, legitimate business operations wrapped around criminal enterprise. "You're giving me an entire division?" "I'm giving you infrastructure," Rafe corrected. "Resources, authority. What you do with it is your decision. But here are the rules. Your team answers to you. You answer to me. And anyone who threatens your operation answers to consequences they won't survive. Beyond that, you have complete operational autonomy." One of the Omega staff members, a woman with sharp eyes and hands scarred from old burns, nameplate reading Naomi-chan, Mandarin, Cantonese, Korean, spoke up. Her voice was careful but firm. "Why would you do this? What's the catch? In my experience, when powerful men build things for Omegas, there's always a catch." Rafe looked at her directly, no deflection, no corporate smoothness. "The catch is competence. You do the work, you get protection. You fail, you're out. But no one, and I mean no one, gets to use your biology as an excuse to dismiss you, threaten you, or leverage you. In this building, inside this division, your skills are your rank. Your languages are your weapons. Your competence is your armor." Another staff member, young, maybe mid-20s, nameplate reading Dmitry Volkov, Russian, Ukrainian, Polish, leaned forward. "And if we refuse? If we decide we don't want to work for a criminal organization? Then you leave," Rafe said simply. "I'm not in the business of forcing cooperation. But if you stay, you're protected, paid well, given resources most translators never see. And you get to build something that matters." Elio felt something crack inside his chest. Not quite hope. He'd learned to be suspicious of hope, but something close. The recognition that maybe, just maybe, someone was building something different. Not better necessarily, not moral, but different. "This doesn't erase what you are," Elio said carefully, still processing, "or what you've done. This division doesn't absolve you of the violence, the deaths, the systems of control." "No," Rafe agreed, meeting his gaze, "but it changes what I'm building going forward. I spent years believing power only came through violence, through fear, through the systematic application of force until resistance became too costly. You showed me it also comes through precision, through understanding what people actually say when they think no one's listening carefully enough to catch them, through knowing which words start wars and which words prevent them. He gestured to the space. The technology, the staff, the infrastructure that represented a significant investment of resources and, more importantly, of vulnerability. Creating a division that didn't depend on violence meant creating something that could be attacked in new ways. "This is me listening," Rafe said. "This is me admitting I was wrong. That dismissing you was the kind of mistake that costs more than money. This is an investment in a different kind of power." Elio touched his belly. 8 months now. The baby's movements were constant. A reminder that time didn't stop for moral reckonings. That decisions made now would echo into a future he was literally carrying. "I'll need full autonomy," Elio said, and he heard his own voice shift into negotiation mode. The tone he'd developed through 100 asylum interviews, the careful firmness of someone who'd learned to advocate without alienating. Hiring, firing, project selection, which jobs we take and which we refuse. "If this is going to work, you can't override my decisions because they're inconvenient." Rafe's jaw tightened. Autonomy meant loss of control, and control was the foundation of his empire. But he nodded. "Agreed. With one condition. You brief me on every project. I don't need to approve, but I need to know. No surprises." "Fair," Elio said. "Then, and if I find you're using this division for something that violates my ethics? Torture intelligence, human trafficking facilitation, anything involving children, I walk. No negotiation. The whole division shuts down." The other Omegas watched this exchange with barely concealed shock. No one negotiated with Rafe Calderón. No one set conditions. No one walked away. But Rafe didn't hesitate. "Agreed. You have my word." "Your word," Naomi said skeptically, "means what exactly in a world where contracts are signed in blood?" Rafe turned to her. "In my world, breaking your word gets you killed. So my word means everything. It's the only currency that actually holds value when violence becomes noise." Elio looked at the other Omegas, saw their desperation, their suspicion, their fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, someone was building something different. Saw himself reflected in their wariness, in their calculation of risk versus opportunity, in their bone-deep exhaustion from surviving systems designed to break them. "Then we have a deal," Elio said. He extended his hand across the space between them, across the distance between victim and perpetrator, between the vulnerable and the violent, across all the complicated territory that didn't fit into simple categories. Rafe shook it. His grip was firm, dry, controlled. A handshake that carried more weight than contracts, more certainty than signatures. And in that moment, something shifted in the Chicago underworld. Not revolution. Revolutions were loud, bloody, temporary. Not redemption. Redemption implied the past could be erased, which it couldn't. But evolution. A small mutation in the DNA of power. A recognition that survival took many forms, and sometimes the most dangerous people were the ones who knew how to listen. 2 months after the division launched, Elio gave birth. A boy, healthy, 7 pounds, 4 ounces. Born in a private hospital where the security was tighter than most government buildings, where armed guards rotated in shifts outside the maternity ward, where every visitor was screened, documented, verified. The labor lasted 14 hours, long enough for Elio to wonder if survival was always this painful, this exhausting, this fundamentally violent in its intimacy. Long enough to understand that bringing life into the world required its own kind of courage, different from but equal to the courage required to stay alive in systems designed to erase you. When the baby finally came, screaming, red-faced, furiously alive, Elio felt something he'd thought lost years ago in detention centers and border rooms. Hope. Not the fragile kind that broke easily, but the stubborn kind that survived precisely because it had been tested, broken, and rebuilt from scar tissue. Rafe visited once. Briefly. He didn't hold the baby, didn't offer congratulations wrapped in performance, didn't try to claim proximity to this new life as if proximity granted ownership. Just stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, looking almost uncomfortable in the presence of something so entirely innocent, so untouched by the violence that defined his world. "You've got 6 weeks leave," Rafe said without preamble. Standard for the division. Then we need you back. The French Algerians are expanding into Belgium, and apparently you're the only one who can navigate Walloon politics without starting a diplomatic incident. Elio, exhausted and overwhelmed and more terrified than he'd ever been in his life, laughed. The sound surprised him, rusty from disuse, but real. Walloon politics. That's your priority right now. Business doesn't stop for biology, Rafe said, but there was something softer in his expression, something almost human beneath the armor. But it can pause. Take the time. Your team is handling the day-to-day operations. Naomi's running point on the current projects. They're good. They're excellent, Elio corrected, feeling fierce pride for people he barely knew but already trusted in ways that surprised him. Better than I expected. Better than they believe they are. You picked them, Rafe pointed out. Of course they're good. The baby, Mateo, Elio had decided, a name that meant gift of God in Spanish, made a small sound. Not quite a cry, just a statement of existence, an announcement that he was here, real, undeniable. Rafe glanced at him, and something flickered across his expression. Not softness exactly, but recognition. The acknowledgement that this small, helpless thing represented a future that extended beyond criminal enterprises and territorial disputes. Does he have a name? Rafe asked. Mateo, Elio said. It means gift of God in Spanish. Seemed appropriate for someone who survived everything that could have gone wrong. Rafe nodded slowly, testing the weight of the name. Mateo Navarro. Just Mateo, Elio corrected gently but firmly. His last name is his own to decide. When he's old enough, when he understands what names mean in this world. I won't burden him with my history or your organization's weight. He gets to choose. Rafe understood immediately. In a world where names carried lethal weight, where bloodlines determined destinies and surnames marked you for violence, giving a child the freedom to choose was its own form of rebellion, its own kind of protection. Smart, Rafe said. Then, in a tone that suggested he'd been calculating, the division is profitable, by the way. Significantly. Turns out precision costs less than cleanup. Prevented conflicts save more money than won wars. Who knew? Elio smiled tiredly. Told you words were currency. You told me words were survival, Rafe corrected. I'm learning the difference. Currency can be spent, lost, stolen. Survival is something else. It's the foundation everything else is built on. He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway, a hesitation that felt significant coming from a man who never hesitated. For what it's worth, Rafe said, not looking back. I'm glad you called me a liar that first day. Most people who do that don't live long enough to prove me wrong. You did both. Changed my organization in the process. I didn't prove you wrong, Elio said, adjusting Mateo in his arms. I just gave you better information. What you did with it was your choice. Rafe's shoulders shook, a silent laugh, barely visible but real. Then he left, footsteps echoing down the hospital corridor, returning to the world of violence and control that Elio had only temporarily escaped. Elio looked down at Mateo, at this small person who didn't know yet how complicated survival was, how many languages you needed to speak just to navigate systems designed to reject you. We're going to be okay, Elio whispered, and for the first time in years he almost believed it. 6 months later, the Translation and Mediation Division had expanded to 12 full-time staff members. 6 Omegas for Betas, 2 Alphas who'd proven they could check their egos at the door and recognize that competence mattered more than biology. They handled everything from contract negotiations to intelligence analysis, from cultural consultation to diplomatic mediation. The Chicago syndicate's reputation had shifted, not softer because soft got you killed, but smarter, more precise, more capable of winning without fighting, of resolving conflicts before they escalated into violence. Fewer wars, better outcomes, higher profit margins. Elio ran the division from a renovated office with a private nursery attached, a concession Rafe had made without being asked. as if he understood that asking Elio to choose between work and parenting would have destroyed the very thing he was trying to build. Matteo spent his days surrounded by the sounds of 7 languages, learning early that the world was bigger and more complex than any single tongue could capture. He babbled in what Elio liked to imagine was proto-multilingual baby talk, responding to Russian and Spanish and Arabic with equal enthusiasm. One afternoon, Rafe appeared without warning. He did that sometimes now, dropped by to discuss projects, ask questions, occasionally bring coffee that was far too expensive for a workplace meeting, but that Elio had learned to accept as Rafe's particular language of respect. "We have a situation," Rafe said, setting down 2 cups, 1 regular coffee, 1 decaf for Elio, because Rafe paid attention to details that surprised people. "The Russians want to renegotiate terms on the northern routes. They're claiming cultural misunderstanding." Elio raised an eyebrow, accepting the coffee. Cultural misunderstanding is code for, "We want a better deal," without admitting we negotiated poorly the first time and our bosses are breathing down our necks. "Exactly," Rafe said. Settling into the chair across from Elio's desk like this had become routine. These consultations, these moments where violence paused for translation. "Which is why I need you to handle the meeting personally. Not just translate the words. Read the subtext. Tell me what they're really saying underneath the diplomatic language." "When?" "Thursday, noon. The usual place." Elio glanced at Matteo, who was napping in his crib in the corner of the office. Tiny fists curled against his chest, completely unaware of the criminal logistics being discussed 6 feet away. "I'll need childcare coverage for the meeting," Elio said. A statement, not a request, because this was part of the arrangement they'd built. "Already arranged," Rafe replied without missing a beat. "Victor's sister, former pediatric nurse, cleared security 6 months ago. She'll be here at 11:30 to give you transition time." Elio blinked, caught off guard despite 6 months of this new normal. "You arranged childcare?" "I arranged competent, trustworthy coverage," Rafe corrected. But there was the ghost of a smile. "There's a difference. One is babysitting. The other is ensuring my division head can do her job without worrying whether her child is safe." "Her job," Elio repeated softly. "Not the job I gave her." "Your job," Rafe confirmed. "You built this. I just provided the infrastructure." But they both knew that wasn't entirely true. Rafe had provided more than infrastructure. He'd provided protection, legitimacy, the kind of institutional backing that turned individual survival into collective power. "Thank you," Elio said quietly, and meant it in ways that extended beyond childcare arrangements. Rafe looked uncomfortable. Gratitude always made him twitchy, as if kindness was a language he'd never quite learned to speak fluently. "Just handle the Russians," he muttered, standing to leave, "and tell me if they're actually planning something or if this is just standard negotiation theater." "They're planning something," Elio said confidently. "The question is whether it's aggressive expansion or defensive repositioning. I'll know better after I hear the subtext." Rafe paused at the door. "You're good at this. Better than anyone I've ever worked with. Better than you probably realize." "I'm a survivor," Elio said simply. "We get good at reading subtext. Our lives depend on it." "It's more than that," Rafe said. "You don't just survive. You build. There's a difference." Then he left, returning to whatever violence awaited him in the floors below, leaving Elio in the quiet office with his sleeping son and the revolutionary idea that maybe survival could be more than just staying alive. Maybe it could be building something worth living for. 1 year later, the division celebrated its first anniversary with a catered lunch and 0 alcohol. Elio's policy, given that half the staff was either pregnant, nursing, or recovering from sense sensitivities that made alcohol physically unbearable. 23 staff members now. They'd opened satellite offices in 3 cities, New York, Los Angeles, Miami, each one serving as a bridge between criminal enterprises and legitimate business, translating not just languages but entire systems of meaning. Rafe attended the celebration, which was unusual enough to make people notice. He stood at the front of the room, looking deeply out of place among the decorations and casual atmosphere, surrounded by people who worked for him but didn't fear him in the traditional way. "I'm not good at speeches," he began, and several people laughed because that was profoundly obvious. "So I'll make this simple. A year ago, I thought languages were for lawyers and liars. I built an empire on the assumption that power came from violence, from the systematic application of force, from making people more afraid of disobeying than dying." He paused, scanning the room. "I was wrong. Not completely, violence still has its place. But I was wrong about what actually builds lasting power. This division has saved this organization more money, prevented more conflicts, and built more strategic alliances than any armed division ever has. And that's because you understood something I didn't. Words don't just describe the world. They build it. They create realities that violence can only destroy." He looked directly at Elio, who was standing near the back, Matteo balanced on his hip, both of them listening with the careful attention that had become their shared language. "So here's to another year," Rafe said, raising a glass of sparkling water. "And to the translator who called me a liar, survived the consequences, and proved me wrong about everything I thought I knew about power." The room raised their glasses. A diverse collection of voices, languages, survival stories united by the understanding that competence was armor, that precision was power, that sometimes the most dangerous people were the ones who knew how to listen. Elio stood, shifting Matteo to his other hip, and met Rafe's gaze across the room. Across all the complicated distance between them, across the space between violence and precision, across the territory that couldn't be mapped with simple moral categories. "To words," Elio said, his voice carrying clearly, "and to the people brave enough to hear them." Epilogue. 3 years later, Matteo was learning his fourth language, Mandarin, because one of Elio's newest hires, a brilliant translator named Dr. Wei Lin, believed children should start tonal languages early, before their brains lost the plasticity that made perfect pitch possible. The division had expanded to 32 staff members spread across 5 cities. They'd become essential infrastructure, not just for the Calderón organization, but for the entire network of criminal enterprises that operated in the gaps between legal systems. The Chicago syndicate's reputation had transformed entirely. Not gentle. Rafe would never be gentle, and the world he operated in didn't reward gentleness, but precise, strategic, known for winning negotiations instead of wars, for building alliances instead of graveyards. Rafe still ruled with calculated ruthlessness, but he consulted the translation division before making major moves. Because precision, it turned out, was more profitable than punishment. Because understanding what people meant saved more money than making examples of what happened when they lied. One evening, after the office had emptied and Matteo had been picked up by the full-time nanny Elio had finally allowed himself to hire, Elio found a file on his desk. Immigration paperwork. Official. Complete. Processed through channels that normally took years, expedited through methods Elio decided not to examine too closely. His permanent residency. Approved. Finalized. Stamped with the kind of bureaucratic authority that transformed temporary survival into permanent belonging. No more annual renewals. No more bureaucratic limbo. No more midnight fears of policy changes, administration shifts, the endless precarity of conditional existence. Just belonging. Legal. Official. Real. There was a note attached in Rafe's precise handwriting. "Words kept this family alive, including yours. You taught me that survival isn't just about force, it's about understanding. About building systems that work better than destroying systems that don't. Thank you for teaching me to listen. RC." Elio pressed the paper to his chest and let himself feel something he'd thought lost years ago. Abandoned in detention centers and border rooms and places where languages collided but humanity didn't. Hope. Not the fragile kind that shattered at the first sign of pressure. The kind built on proof, on evidence, on 3 years of watching impossible things become real through the accumulated weight of small, persistent choices. He looked around his office, at the maps marking satellite locations, at the photographs of staff members who'd become family, at the shelf of reference materials in 17 languages, at Mateo's toys scattered in the corner where violence paused for innocence. And he understood finally what Rafe had been building, what they'd been building together. Not redemption. The past couldn't be erased, and trying to erase it dishonored everyone who'd survived it. Not revolution. The systems were still there, still violent, still breaking people. But evolution, mutation, small changes in the DNA of power that suggested different futures were possible. That survival could be more than just staying alive. That words could build worlds where violence had only known how to destroy them. Elio picked up his phone and sent a simple message to Rafe. Thank you for listening, for changing, for proving that even power can learn new languages. The response came immediately. Thank you for teaching me, for surviving, for showing me that the most dangerous weapon isn't violence. It's precision. Elio smiled, filed the immigration papers in his personal safe, and turned off the office lights. Tomorrow there would be more negotiations, more translations, more navigating the complicated territory between survival and transformation. But tonight he was going home, to an apartment he owned, in a city where he belonged, with legal documentation that proved his existence mattered beyond utility. He was going home, and for the first time in his life, home meant more than just a place he hadn't been forced to leave yet. It meant belonging. The end.